She stands at the foot of the cross while the others flee. She watches the tomb being sealed, and then she is the very first person to encounter the resurrected Christ. If you actually look at the gospel accounts objectively, Mary Magdalene is a central, pivotal figure of the entire movement. Yet, and here's the thing that really gets me, for nearly 2,000 years, the cultural memory of this woman has been hijacked by an entirely different image: the repentant, fallen woman, the prostitute. It is honestly one of history's most durable and damaging branding campaigns. How on earth did a leading female apostle become synonymous with a life of sin? Does that label even exist anywhere in the original texts, or is it just an artifact of later, calculated history? To find the answer, we have to look past the stained glass and the sermons and head back to a chilly Sunday in 591 AD. Picture a stone-walled basilica in Rome. Pope Gregory the Great mounts the pulpit. The air is heavy with the scent of beeswax and cold stone. Rome is in a state of decay. Lombard invaders are circling the city. The old imperial structures are crumbling, and the church is desperate to consolidate power. In his homily, Gregory performs a kind of narrative alchemy. He takes three distinct women from the gospel accounts: the anonymous sinner who anoints Jesus' feet in Luke 7, Mary of Bethany, and Mary of Magdala, and collapses them into one singular tragic figure. In that moment, he effectively brands Mary Magdalene as a reformed sex worker. It was a strategic consolidation of identity. For the medieval congregation, the sermon settled the matter. The identity was fixed. The preacher's authority eclipsed the original fragmented accounts for nearly 2 millennia. But let us strip away the additions and look at what we actually find. The Gospels portray a committed, independent follower. She travels with the ministry, which, let's be clear, was a deeply unconventional choice for a woman in first-century Judea. This wasn't a modest or invisible role. Traveling with an itinerant rabbi meant leaving one's home, family, and social protections. It implies she possessed significant personal resources and a dangerous level of autonomy. Magdala, her hometown, was a major economic hub on the Sea of Galilee, famous for its sophisticated salted fish industry, a delicacy exported all the way to the markets of Rome. This suggests she was a woman of considerable means, an entrepreneur in her own right, not a destitute outcast. She was living outside the rigid honor-shame codes that governed women's lives in that era. Her presence at the crucifixion is the most revealing metric. The male disciples, those with the traditional roles, have vanished. They are hiding. Mary Magdalene remains. She stands at the foot of the cross, bearing witness to the agony when the others are gone. If she were a peripheral figure, her presence at these specific climactic moments would be less remarkable. Instead, she is the constant observer. Why does this history get rewritten? It comes down to control. The early church was building a rigid, hierarchical structure. An apostle who claimed direct, unmediated access to the divine, who had seen the resurrected Christ before anyone else, presented a problem for an institution that was increasingly defined by office and ordination. By binding Mary Magdalene to the identity of a fallen woman, the institution effectively recategorized her. She was no longer an apostle. She became a cautionary tale. She was no longer a leader. She was someone who required the institution's salvation. This shift turns her from a peer into a subordinate. The confusion hinges on a technical misreading of Luke chapter 7. An unnamed woman breaks into a Pharisee's house, weeps at Jesus' feet, and dries them with her hair. The text labels her a hamartolos, a sinner. But the Greek text is precise. It does not name her. It does not identify her as Mary of Magdala. When the author of the Gospel of Luke introduces Mary Magdalene just a few verses later, in chapter 8, he does so as if she is a new character entirely. He identifies her specifically, a woman from whom Jesus cast out 7 demons. If she were the same woman from the previous chapter, the narrative would surely link them. It does not. And those 7 demons? In the context of the first century, these were historically understood as spiritual or physical afflictions, perhaps mental illness, epilepsy, or severe trauma, not a moral indictment of sex work. The text itself is silent on the idea that she was a prostitute. It is a detail the church invented, not one it inherited. In any court, in any era, the strength of your case is defined by the quality of your witnesses. Let's be real for a second. If you are building an argument that will shift the gears of history, if you are asserting that a dead man has walked out of a tomb, you choose your witnesses with the precision of a surgeon. You look for men of standing. You look for property owners, patriarchs, or scribes. You want testimony that moves the needle of the law, right? Yet, the foundational claim of Christianity does not rest on a magistrate, a priest, or a high-ranking soldier. It rests on a woman named Mary Magdalene. And here is the paradox that should freeze your blood. In first-century Judea, Mary Magdalene was, by the letter of the law, a ghost. Her testimony? Legally inadmissible. In a courtroom, she was effectively silent. So why would a movement desperate for credibility, anchor its entire truth claim on someone the state had already declared unfit? This isn't just a theological narrative. It is a dissection of a systemic contradiction. If you were engineering a successful, high-stakes religious startup, you would never start here. Yet, they did. Now, I need to back up for a second. We aren't talking about a vague social bias or a polite suggestion. We are talking about rigid, written codes. In the legal framework of first-century Judea, testimony was governed by strict evidentiary requirements, codified in the Mishnaic tradition. To establish a fact in court, to prove an event actually happened, you needed at least 2 witnesses. And not just any witnesses. They had to be adult, free-born men of good standing. This isn't speculation. The rules explicitly excluded women, slaves, and minors from acting as witnesses. A woman's account was treated as hearsay, or worse, as unreliable noise. You did not bring a woman to a judge to prove a point. You brought her to be dismissed. This was a structural barrier as solid as stone. To walk through a market in Jerusalem as a woman was to navigate a world where your observations, your emotions, and your experiences held the legal weight of a whisper in a hurricane. If you witnessed a robbery, a murder, or a miracle, your testimony was not just ignored, it was irrelevant. Imagine living in a society where the law fundamentally denies your capacity to see reality accurately. You possess the facts, but the legal machinery treats you as a blind spot. This wasn't just a political exclusion, it was a psychological isolation. You are physically present, yet legally absent. For Mary Magdalene to be the one to testify to the empty tomb was to engage in an act of profound social defiance. She was carrying a truth that the entire legal system of her world was engineered to reject. But here's where it gets interesting. Consider the alternative witnesses available to the writers of these accounts. Think of Joseph of Arimathea. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, a man of wealth, and a man of high legal standing. If you were writing a piece of fiction designed to convince the Roman authorities or the Jewish High Council that the grave was empty, Joseph is your star witness. He is exactly who you would put on the stand. He has the social capital, he has the legal eligibility. But the gospel writers, they did not do that. They pushed the elites to the sidelines and placed the entire weight of the resurrection on Mary. If the gospel accounts were a manufactured PR strategy, they failed immediately. They chose to lead with a witness who the law would strike from the record before she even opened her mouth. That is not just a weak argument, it is political suicide. But the fact that they kept her at the center suggests they were not operating from a PR playbook. They were operating from memory. They were reporting what actually happened, regardless of how inconvenient, how absurd, or how legally impossible it made their claims. If this were a fabrication, they would have edited her out. They would have swapped her for a male disciple. The legal impossibility of her testimony is, ironically, the strongest evidence for the story's authenticity. It is a messy, inconvenient truth that they refused to sanitize. They didn't prioritize the credibility of their witnesses. They prioritized the fidelity of their experience. But there is a secondary layer to this danger. Being a female follower of an itinerant rabbi was not just a theological choice, it was a physical risk. In the volatile environment of first-century Judea, where Roman patrols moved through the streets like predators, and local religious authorities were constantly looking for heresy to crush, a woman traveling with a group of men outside of her family unit was a target. She was vulnerable to assault, to accusations of impropriety, and to the shifting, dangerous winds of revolutionary politics. And honestly, her presence in the inner circle wasn't a footnote. It was an ongoing scandal. By clinging to the story of her witnessing the resurrection, the early movement was not only defying the laws of evidence, they were defending a social deviance that made them look like a cult, not a credible religious institution. It was a massive, massive liability. Yet, the story persists. It doesn't disappear. And that is exactly where the anxiety of the later church hierarchy takes root. Once the movement transitioned from an underground sect into an institutionalized power, they faced a recurring problem: Mary Magdalene. As a primary witness who claimed direct, unmediated access to the divine, she held a position of authority that no later exclusively male hierarchy could easily control. That creates a crisis for an institution obsessed with order and a rigid chain of command. If the woman at the bottom of the legal hierarchy is the only one who truly understands the source of the faith, then the hierarchy is inherently shaky. So what does a system do when it cannot silence a witness? It rebrands her. For centuries, the narrative remained relatively stable until the year 591 AD. This is when Pope Gregory the Great delivered a series of sermons that would effectively shift the course of history for Mary Magdalene. Gregory made a cold calculation. He conflated Mary Magdalene with two other figures mentioned in the New Testament: the unnamed sinful woman who anointed Jesus' feet in Luke, and Mary of Bethany. By merging these three distinct women, Gregory transformed a primary witness into a penitent sinner, a cautionary tale of someone who needed redemption rather than someone who possessed the primary key to the faith. This rebrand was an act of political brilliance and historical suppression. By turning her into a symbol of past sexual sin, the hierarchy retroactively stripped her of her apostolic authority. If she was a sinner in need of salvation, she was an unlikely candidate to be the foundational authority for the church. It is perhaps one of the most effective political suppressions in the history of the Western world. You don't spend over 1,000 years trying to diminish a witness unless that witness has something the hierarchy desperately needs to contain. The effort required to erase her is the measurement of her power. Mary Magdalene is the most famous woman in the New Testament, right? But if you really stare at the canonical Gospels, she is essentially a ghost. She stands at the foot of the cross. She visits the tomb. She is the first witness to the resurrection. And then she simply vanishes from the narrative. It is a deafening, deliberate silence. But here's the thing. In December 1945, near the limestone cliffs of Jabal el-Tarif in Upper Egypt, everything changed. A farmer named Muhammad Ali el-Saman was digging for fertilizer, specifically a nutrient-rich soil called sabak, when his mattock struck something that didn't sound like earth. It was a massive, sealed red earthenware jar, roughly 3 feet tall, wedged deep into the rock. And honestly, he hesitated. He was living through a localized, violent blood feud, and he was terrified that what he found might be gold, or perhaps evidence of a crime that would invite the police or his enemies to his door. He broke the seal. He didn't find gold. He found 13 leather-bound codices, hidden away for over 1,600 years. The air in that cave was stale, thick with the smell of dry, crumbling papyrus and the damp, metallic scent of the earth. Now, when you look at high-resolution photos of these pages today, the contrast is violent. The desert outside is bleached white by a sun that burns everything. But these pages carry the stagnant, cool shadow of a community that knew exactly what would happen if their text were discovered. They were not merely buried. They were hidden from an institution that wanted them incinerated. This is not just a story about a lost gospel. It is a story about the structural erasure of a woman who claimed an authority the early church spent centuries attempting to dismantle. We are unraveling the tension between the saint, the penitent, silenced figure of the canon, and the visionary, the leader found in the dust of Egypt. Let's look at the document that started it all, the Gospel of Mary. The scene is raw, completely stripped of the polished, pious veneer of the later church. Jesus has ascended, and the disciples are huddled together, terrified, paralyzed by the conviction that they are next on the Roman chopping block. They are a group of men failing in the face of fear. Mary, however, she stands up. She speaks words of comfort, and more importantly, she recounts a private vision Jesus shared with her and only her. This is the moment the narrative cracks. Peter, the rock upon which the church would eventually be built, reacts with immediate, simmering hostility. The irritation in the text is palpable, almost acidic. He asks, did he really speak privately with a woman and not openly to us? He isn't just questioning her story. He is questioning her character. He is effectively asking, are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us? Levi, another disciple, steps in to call Peter an adversary. This is not a polite theological treatise. It is a raw, ugly power struggle. And it reveals exactly why this text was an existential threat. To understand why this text was so dangerous, we have to grasp the Gnostic worldview. Gnostics didn't just believe in a different theology. They believed that the physical world was a mistake, a trap created by a flawed, lower deity. If the world is a prison and the human spirit is trapped inside it, then the institutional church, with its bishops, priests, and hierarchies, is largely irrelevant. Mary's authority in the text is based on gnosis, direct, unmediated knowledge. In her vision, she describes the soul's ascent to heaven, navigating past the archons, the cosmic jailers that try to stop the soul from returning to the light. Think of the archons as the bureaucratic customs agents of the universe. Each one guards a gate, and each one demands a specific, secret password. But it goes deeper than a simple password. The soul isn't just flying through a void. It is undergoing a psychological audit. The first gate is darkness. The second, desire. The third, ignorance. To pass, you don't offer a bribe. You offer evidence that you have shed those attachments. If you cannot prove that you are no longer bound by these earthly cravings, the archon drags you back down. It is a terrifying prospect. It implies that salvation is not a gift bestowed by a priest, but a skill you must master. It means that if Mary knew the passwords, she knew how to bypass the very people who claim to hold the keys to the kingdom. If you are a leader in the early church, building a power structure around the 12 apostles and the concept of apostolic succession, that kind of claim is a nightmare. It bypasses the entire organization. The church didn't just suppress these texts because they disagreed with the dogma. They suppressed them because that version of Mary made the institution obsolete. She was an unmanageable witness. They needed disciples who followed the hierarchy, not visionaries who claimed they had seen things the bishops hadn't. We see Mary referred to in early Christian writings as Apostola Apostolorum, the apostle to the apostles. She is the one who carries the news of the resurrection. But then we hit the year 591 AD. Pope Gregory the Great delivers a famous sermon that effectively rewrites history. He mashes together three distinct women mentioned in the Gospels: Mary of Bethany, the unnamed woman who anointed Jesus' feet, and Mary Magdalene, into one singular person. He creates a composite character, a penitent prostitute. Once he does that, the apostle to the apostles vanishes. She is replaced by the repentant sinner. This is a massive, historic act of rebranding. The creation of the Magdalene the prostitute isn't just a clerical error. It is a brilliant, if devastating, piece of PR. By merging three distinct women, the church didn't just mute a voice, they manufactured a moral tale. It is a story of redemption that centers the church's grace as the only path to salvation. It turns a fierce leader into a cautionary tale. That is how you dismantle a threat. You don't burn the books, you rewrite the character. You replace the authority with the penitent. If she is the apostle to the apostles, she has authority, she has a voice, and she has a direct line to the divine. If she is a broken, repentant sinner, she needs the institution to save her. One version is a threat, the other is a success story for the organization. That shift didn't just change a sermon, it changed how the world viewed her for 1,500 years. It is startling how a single administrative decision, a sermon, a canonization list, can be more powerful than actual events. Once you see this pattern, you realize that history is less about what happened and more about what we decide to keep. If you are in charge, you want people who follow the rules, who rely on the structure. You don't want independent visionaries. When you see how quickly the apostle became the sinner, you realize how fragile memory really is. Consider this. If the 1945 discovery at Nag Hammadi had occurred in the year 300, not 1945, if the Gospel of Mary had been part of the standard canon, sitting right alongside Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, would the early church have allowed female leadership to flourish? It is tempting to say yes, but I suspect the issue was never really the text itself. The issue was the mechanism of power. The Gnostic texts were suppressed because they were fundamentally incompatible with an institution that prioritized stability and hierarchical order. Even if the Gospel of Mary had been included, the system would have minimized it. They would have framed her as an exception, not a standard for the faith. That is the tragedy. It is not just the loss of the scrolls in the desert, it is the systematic narrowing of what was considered acceptable. We are left with the silence of the canonical Mary and the fragments of the Gnostic Mary. The struggle to define Mary Magdalene is, in truth, a struggle to define authority itself. Whether one views her through the lens of institutional history or Gnostic vision, she remains the most pivotal yet elusive figure in the story of Jesus. We are left with the 1945 discovery in the Egyptian heat, the 591 AD sermon by Pope Gregory, and that haunting title, Apostola Apostolorum. Is Mary's true identity lost in the shadows of history, or is she hiding in plain sight in the texts we chose to forget? That question isn't going away. It is sitting in the margins of everything we think we know.